Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Shagun Saklani Pandey and I am a faculty in the School of Social Work, TISS, Mumbai. The title of today's module is Children and Armed Conflict. This particular module is part of the paper on criminology. Children and armed conflict continues to be a very important area to be studied. However, ironically, it is one of the most under-researched area. But millions of children across the globe have been suffering due to different kind of conflicts. Today, in this particular module, we will be broadly looking at the phenomena of armed conflict and how it impacts children across the globe. And then we will also be looking at the various legal measures that are available to protect the rights of these children who are living in conflict situations. The overall content of the module is a brief introduction on armed conflict, followed by looking at how armed conflict has its own consequences, then how armed conflict has an impact on children, and what are the various legal measures available for the protection of these children, followed by some concluding thoughts. Cut. Good. Let us start with section 1, that is entitled Armed Conflict and Introduction. Let me bring forward a very important and interesting definition that was brought out by Graça Machel in 2001. She was a special representative of the UN Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. She stated, "War violates every right of a child, the right to life, the right to be with family and community, the right to health, the right to development of personality, and the right to be nurtured and protected." This particular definition gives us an holistic understanding as to how children who live amidst the situations of armed conflict get impacted by it. During situations of armed conflict, children continue to be one of the most vulnerable sections of the society. They get directly and indirectly affected by situations of armed conflict. When we say directly getting affected by armed conflict, we mean that often we see that children get directly involved or participate in armed conflict situations. They often become child soldiers, or they are often forced to take up jobs like that of an informer, messenger, cook for the armed groups, etc. On the other hand, every child who lives in a situation of armed conflict is also affected indirectly by it. The reasons for that will be explained in the coming sections. One also sees that despite of number of legal safeguards that are available for the protection of children in situations of armed conflict, the situation still remains grim. Child rights to survival, development, protection are all threatened during situations of armed conflict. Now let us look at what armed conflict really means. The international humanitarian law has defined armed conflict under two broad categories: international armed conflict and intrastate armed conflict. The international armed conflict basically would mean where two state parties are involved. So we can say that something like a world war would be categorized under the international armed conflict. However, what we see today is more of intrastate armed conflict. This means that the parties who are involved in conflict are one, the state or the non-state actors. Now we look at some of the relevant definitions that look at armed conflict in different ways. The first definition of armed conflict here says that armed conflict is a contested incompatibility which concerns government and or territory where the use of armed force between two parties, of which at least one is the government of a state, results in at least 25 battle-related deaths in one calendar year. Boyden et al. Brings out a more social cultural definition of armed conflict. He states that armed conflict is a mechanism of social transformation that may originate either in competing claims over resources or power, or in conflicting cultural or social values, and is often aggravated by low levels of human security. The next definition, we look at how armed conflict differs from that of a war. Armed conflict are characterized by an absence of heavy and unconventional weapon or superpower patrons, as they are replaced by a typical low intensity conflict between government and small untrained rebel forces who are equipped with smaller arms and with light weapons as regards to high magnitude foreign interventions and technology that are adopted during war. Chinoy and Chinoy have also brought out different natures of armed conflict. They state that armed conflicts are sporadic and not continuous in nature, erupting with varied levels of violence at different times and sometimes shifts from one community or issues to another and are sustained over a long period of time. So far we have seen what armed conflict really means and we have defined it differently. We shall now look into what are some of the consequences of armed conflict. As I stated earlier, armed conflict have many direct and indirect consequences. They may range from that of extreme forms of violence, bloodshed, displacement, economic insecurity, etc. Conflict also creates a space for wide scale of exploitation, suppression and underdevelopment. Also, armed conflict does not only affect people, but actually affects the entire society or the community, its institution, its people and different political and social cultural institutions and structures also. Especially when we talk of intrastate armed conflict, we see that these particular conflicts are very local in nature. They are fought within a community. Therefore, intrastate armed conflict also leads to a lot of widespread civilian deaths and also that of security forces. Displacement also is one of the major consequences of armed conflict, and it further has its own long and short term impact on people and also on children. There is also, in situations of armed conflict, one experiences a continued sense of fear, economic insecurity, weakened social ties, disruption in family, community, etc. So in totality we can say that armed conflict, be it intra or international in nature, actually disrupts the everyday life of its people and does not have any exception for children. Our next section will look at children in armed conflict. Before starting the section, let me just state some interesting facts and figures that will bring out the grave situation in which our children are living in situations of armed conflict across the globe. Around 20 million civilians are killed in around 150 armed conflict in developing countries since the Second World War. The majority of these people were women and children. Around 1.5 billion children, which actually amounts to around 2/3 of the total world's children's population, lives amidst armed conflict in around 42 countries between 2006 and 2000. This statistics has been brought out by UNICEF. Around 80 to 90% of those who die or get injured in situations of armed conflict are children and women. When one talks about the survivors of conflict, one sees that around 1 million children have been orphaned so far in situations of armed conflict. Also, around 20 million children have been displaced to refugee or internally displacement camps across the globe. Children comprise of around 46% of world's total displacement population. So these figures have actually brought in and has set a context wherein we see that so many children across the globe have been affected by armed conflict. As I stated earlier, armed conflict have some direct and indirect impact on children. When we say direct, it would mean many a times we see that children are often forced to participate in armed conflict. Children get recruited as child soldiers by state and other non-state actors as well. On the other hand, many a times children are also forced to take up jobs like that of a cook, a messenger, an informer, etc. On the other hand, we also see that children get affected indirectly by conflict. By the very idea of staying in situations of armed conflict, children are often exposed to various experiences. Many a times, they also see their family members being killed, their siblings being killed, and they experience a lot of violence and bloodshed. On the other hand, many of them also get affected by displacement and other forms that arise out of armed conflict. There is also a reduced capability of adults to protect children. There is lack of development support. There is also deprivation during times of displacement, starvation, lack of medical and educational facilities also. However, if we have to list down certain grave violations that have occurred for children in situations of armed conflict, they can be listed as killing or maiming. Maiming basically means a permanent wound or an injury that may also result into mutilation or disfiguration for a child forever. Recruitment or use of children as child soldiers, rape and other forms of sexual abuse, abduction, attacks against schools and hospitals, and also denial of humanitarian access. We can also now look into what are some of the experiences that children face during situations of armed conflict. However, the experiences that children face are varied, but for understanding's sake, we've listed them down under broad categories. The first category is that of social disruption. Conflict-induced displacement from homeland, family dispersal, separation, destitution, loss of service access, and social interaction, and the intermediary presence of military personnel are some of the major reasons for social disruption in a child's life. Next is that of lack of access to services. During armed conflict, the accessibility, availability, and affordability of services are disrupted. Children's right to survival and development is often hindered, and this actually leads to a long-term impact on these children. The next broad experience that often children experience is that of impoverishment. Impoverishment in simple words would mean limited or lack of resources. That could mean material or other resources also. It has been observed that across conflict in different regions, that those who are vulnerable economically are the ones who get marginalized to such adversities the most. Factors like loss of income, unemployment, physical destruction of agricultural resources, mass displacement, death or disappearance of the breadwinner of the family, no more availability of land for farming and other utility services due to presence of landmines, loss of livestock, and some of the major reasons for impoverishment. Children also get directly affected by impoverishment. It increases the pressure on them to work. In fact, when we look around, we often see that in situations of armed conflict, there are many child-headed households also. There is also a threat to physical integrity of children. Children in communities that are affected by conflict are at constant risk of being subjected to different forms of violation by state and non-state actors. These violations may range from physical violence, which often lead to many a time disability of long term, torture, sexual violence, extrajudicial detention, killing or recruitment. Many children often go missing in situations of armed conflict also. Children are often detained, frequently without any charge, and commonly without the presence of any legal representative or even their parents. Children who stay in displacement camps are also vulnerable to harassment and other forms of abuse. Children are often caught between state and non-state actors. Hence, they face exploitation and harassment from both sides. There is also a transformation in children's roles and responsibilities. During conflict, the survival and productive options of families and communities undergo a transformation. With income and employment capacities of families being drastically hit, the economic roles and responsibilities alter in many cases. Children take up responsibilities. As I said, in situations of armed conflict, we often see child-headed households. We often see many a times that girls in the family take up roles of their parents, be it mother or father. Many a times we also see that the elder siblings suddenly becomes a parent in the family. However, children get into the economic sphere in varied ways. Some also get recruited as combatants. Also, some of them are forced to get into hazardous work like that of child labor, etc. Many a times children also who live in displacement camps also get affected by these transformed roles and responsibilities. So far we have looked at different definitions of armed conflict, which are international, national, socio-cultural in nature and otherwise. We have also looked at how armed conflict impacts various people and especially with a focus on children. We shall now look into what are the various legal measures that are available for protection of the rights of these children who live in situations of armed conflict. The United Nations Conventions on Right of the Child, popularly known as the UNCRC, is one of the major tools that has come out on an international level to safeguard the rights of child in all situations, be it war or peace. It provides a strong legislative framework for realizing the rights of every child on this earth. The United Nations General Assembly adopted the UNCRC in 1989. India ratified the UNCRC in 1992. The CRC is one of the first human rights treaty to cover all categories of human rights. Interestingly, the UNCRC is also one treaty that has been ratified by all nations across the globe, except for United States of America and Somalia. The United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child lays down the various rights under four broad categories. These are right to protection, right to life, survival and development, right to non-discrimination, and right to participation. We shall now be looking into these rights with a more focus. The right to protection is seen as a cross-cutting objective of all humanitarian actions. The basic components of emergency aid, like that of food, clothing, shelter, water and sanitation, health and hygiene, are all aimed at protecting people's life and also that of children. Social protection, however, continues to be one of the most ignored sections in the field of children and armed conflict. The UNCRC recognizes that children are vulnerable and they need protection at all times, be it peace or war situations. We are now looking at some of the articles that are laid down under the UNCRC that talk about the right to protection of every child. Article 6 states that the state has an obligation to ensure child's right to survival and development. Article 19 and 37 have also stressed that child's right to freedom from abuse and neglect are of utmost importance. Article 20 guarantees protection of children without family. Article 24 ensures that state parties recognize the right of the child to the enjoyment of highest attainable standards of health and facilities for treatment of illness and rehabilitation of health. There are many articles that are laid down under the right of protection, and these can be referred to in the module on children and armed conflict. The other set of rights that are laid down by the UNCRC are the right to life, survival and development of every child. This particular category looks at the basic health care, disease prevention and control, nutrition, clean water supply, sanitation and environmental health, early learning and stimulation, education, leisure and cultural activities, family guidance and care. There are certain articles that have laid down what every state party needs to do if they have ratified the UNCRC in terms of the right to life, survival and development. Article 6 states that every child has the inherent right to life, and the state parties shall ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and development of every child. The right to survival and development is also closely linked to healthcare services and other educational services. Any disruption in the affordability, availability and accessibility of these services, that is of healthcare, education, sanitation, clean drinking water, etc., directly has an impact on children. These impacts could be short term, also long term in nature. The next important right that is laid down by this UNCRC for every child is that of the right to participation. It promotes empowerment and capacity of children to be involved in decision making at all times. It also identifies issues that are related to civil rights and freedom. Some of them are freedom of expression, thought, conscience and religion, association and peaceful assembly. Children in situations of armed conflict also have the right to participate in decision making and other peace processes, either during conflict or post-conflict situations. Article 12 places an obligation on the state and on the governments to ensure that every child's view are sought and considered in all matters that affect their lives. Article 13 and 14 talk about child's right to expression, freedom of thought, conscience and religion. Article 17 also laid down the right of every child to information. Article 5 has a vital importance to us. When working with girls and boys, it is important to keep their evolving capacities in mind. The other important right that is laid down by the UNCRC is that of right to non-discrimination. The UNCRC promotes non-discrimination, inclusion of every child in making efforts for creating a gender balance. It would mean that no discrimination of children should happen on the basis of their age, caste, class, gender, etc. Article 23 highlights the need to work with children with special needs also, and see ways in which the duty bearers can create certain environments where inclusion of these children is possible. The UNCRC does not allow for any derogation in times of emergencies like that of armed conflict. The full range of rights it articulates and applies in all circumstances. Especially in situations of armed conflict, the humanitarian laws like that of the UNCRC also lays down that it is important that every state party provides a child-friendly space. This would mean a space where a child is protected at all times and also has a place to play and leisure with full protection. It also talks about mobilizing communities for child participation, integrating child protection into disaster preparedness, advocacy and communication. Also about restoring access to education as an important tool for development. Now we shall be looking into some of the international laws and provisions that are available for children in situations of armed conflict. Especially the international laws and provisions like that of international humanitarian law has provided for certain general and certain special protection for children who are living in situations of armed conflict. Children can benefit from these general and from special protections. The Geneva Convention of 1949 and the additional protocols of 1977 lays down certain special protection for these children. Additional protocols, the UNCRC and its optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict in particular also sets limit of child's participation in hostilities. Some of the general protection are laid down by the Geneva Convention 4 and the Additional Protocol 1. In particular, the right to life, the prohibition on coercion, corporal punishment, torture, collective punishment and reprisal are laid down in the Geneva Convention 4 and the Additional Protocol 1. Article 48 and 51 of the Additional Protocol 1 states that distinction must be made between civilians and combatants, and prohibition on attacks against civilians is must. Some of the special protections are laid down by the Geneva Convention 4. It specially talks about some of the special guarantees that need to be given to children. Article 77 of the Additional Protocol 1 states that children shall be the object of special respect and shall be protected against any form of indecent assault. Parties to the conflict shall provide them with the care and aid they require, whether because of their age or any other reason. Especially in situations of armed conflict, we see that children are often forced into participation in hostilities. The Additional Protocol 1 states, has actually put an obligation on all the states to take all feasible measures to prevent children under 15 from taking direct part in hostilities. Article 77, however, raised this age from 15 to 18 years of age. Article 4, paragraph 3 of Additional Protocol 2 prohibits both the recruitment and participation of children, be it directly or indirectly, in hostilities under 15 years of age. The four 1949 Geneva Conventions and their 1977 additional protocols laid down certain important areas. These are rules on death penalty, access to food and medical care, education in conflict zones, detention, separation from their families, and participation of children in hostilities. The additional protocol 1 and 2 of the Geneva Convention of 1949 forbids that children below the age of 15 cannot be recruited in any form of hostilities. However, this age was then increased from 15 to 18 years by the optional protocol on the Convention on the Rights of the Child on Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict in the year 2000. All state parties to this protocol also need to raise the minimum age for voluntary recruitment from 15 to 18 years. So currently, the minimum age for recruitment of children in any form of hostility by the state or the non-state actors continues to be 18 years. Now, as we have looked at the broad area of children in armed conflict, we have looked at the various definitions of armed conflict, we have looked at how children are affected by armed conflict in various ways, be it directly or indirectly. We have also looked at certain legal measures that are available for the protection of these children. We shall now be winding up with some concluding thoughts in this regard. Some of the important thoughts that you may also would want to think on are that children have been a neglected section in situations of armed conflict. They continue to be one of the most vulnerable sections in situations of armed conflict. However, one does see a change that is happening around in terms of our involvement with children and bringing out various researches in this field. However, I must say that still a lot needs to be done in this field. Children also need to be a part of peace processes and not just as passive beneficiaries, but must also become active participants in their own way. Article 12 of the CRC states that children have the right to have their views heard and given due importance and weight in any decision that affects them. Especially when we talk of post-conflict situations, it becomes very important that every child's view is heard and included in various decision-making processes and other peace-building processes in that area. Historically, however, the process of securing peace, reconciliation and reconstruction a country have neglected the specific needs of children. However, this needs to change. To ensure that long-term peace, security, development of a country, it has become accepted that children, having played a significant role in the conflict as victims, witnesses and perpetrators of violence and war crimes, must not be ignored or marginalized in any kind of peace processes during or post-conflict situations. It is very important that we now look at children with the child rights perspective. Looking at children with the child rights perspective would mean that every child is not looked as a passive recipient of the government or the non-government actors or any other services that are provided to them. But they need to become active participants, and also we all should now start looking at children as right holders and also active agents in their own way. The child rights perspective thus implies strengthening the capacity and accountability of all stakeholders such as government, non-government actors, communities, families to address the issue of child protection and facilitate the process of reconstruction and rehabilitation of communities. Children's voice should be heard and they need to be involved in decision making, designing intervention for reconstruction and resettlement. Cut. Working with children with the child rights perspective would also mean that no child should be discriminated based on their age, gender, class or ethnicity or any sort of disability also. Protection of children's need be given utmost importance and to be placed central to all actions to promote peace, implement peace agreements and resolve conflict. So, I have given you a brief overview of what children in situations of armed conflict is. However, there are many more readings that one needs to do in order to understand the overall picture of children in situations of armed conflict. This particular module has been prepared keeping special needs of children in situations of armed conflict in mind. I strongly recommend that you all refer to the module in detail to get a better understanding and also to contribute more to this particular field of children and armed conflict. Thank you.
Action.
So, in this particular module on children and armed conflict, we have looked at the definition of armed conflict, which has given you an understanding of what armed conflict comprises of, what is the various nature that exists on armed conflict. We've also looked at as how armed conflict affects children. There are many direct and indirect impacts of armed conflict on children. It has also looked at the various legal measures that are in place for the protection of children, especially in situations of armed conflict. However, I strongly recommend that you go through the module to get a better understanding of this particular situation of children and armed conflict. I also feel that all of us in our own ways need to contribute to this particular field of children and armed conflict. Thank you. Cut.